photographer with us. So you can take it away from there, Alan.
Thank you very much, Dan. So I started taking pictures of mushrooms around 2001. And when I started, I was really bad at it. And I continued to be really bad at it for many years. So I learned to take pictures just by taking terrible pictures for a long time. So what I'm going to try to do during this talk is to teach you everything that I wish I had known, or I wish that people had told me when I first started. And if I had seen a talk like this in 2001, it would have saved me 10 years of taking really bad pictures. So first, I'm going to go through a bunch of pictures that I've taken recently. There's some stuff that I just processed that I like, and kind of give some general photography tips on how I got the results that I did. And then I'll go through cell phone photography and how to get good pictures out of a cell phone. And then later, how to use a DSLR or mirrorless camera, take high-end pictures, and do some advanced stuff like image stacking. Okay, I imagine you can see this now. So here is a Havella macropus, and this is one that I found in Michigan. And there was just one of them. So when there's just one mushroom, it can be pretty hard to get a good photo out of it. So what I did is I put the camera as close as I possibly could. And then I put a bunch of lights around it, so it's pretty well lit, and then did photo stacking to get lots of resolution and also a nice blurry background. And then here is some tricky decipiens, and this I found in Nevada City just a couple days ago. And this one's not a fungus at all. The slime molds are more closely related to amoebas, but they make excellent photographic subjects, especially if you have a macro lens and can do focus stacking. So you can see the texture of the stem and everything. And when I first uploaded this picture to iNaturalist, I uploaded just the cell phone photo, and a few different slime mold experts saw it, and they were not able to identify it. They couldn't even figure out what genus it was in, because these things are so small that it look like red dots. But once I processed the photo and did the photo stacking, I sent the photo to Stu, and he immediately recognized it as Trichia decipiens because of the orange inside the stem. So taking really good quality pictures can help a lot with identification. And then here is a pseudohydnum. And whenever I see these, I'm like, oh, awesome. I got to take some lights and put them behind them and take pictures. So that's what I always do, and end up looking like ice sculptures or something. Super cool looking thing. Common name is cat's tongue on them. And then a couple days ago in Wildcat Canyon in East Bay, I found this nice Schizophyllum comuni. And Schizophyllum comuni has over 28,000 sexes. But the reason I was so interested in it is I had seen some photos in the Facebook group Fluorescent Forest where people shined ultraviolet light on them. And so Fluorescent Forest is a pretty cool Facebook group because it's all about stuff that glows at night, both bioluminescent and fluorescent. So if you're into that stuff, you should definitely join that group. But I shine the ultraviolet light on it, and they glow this really cool blue color on the gills. And I also like to photograph petri dishes, these agrocultures. So what I do is I set the petri dish in a flow hood, and I put a bunch of lights around and open up the aperture and do photo stacking. So even though it's flat, I find it really helps to photo stack these things. So this is about 15 pictures combined. And that way I get really nice detail on the whole thing. This one is Psilocybe ovoidiocystidiata. And then I processed it a little bit more with Photoshop. So these two are actually the same picture, but just different settings in Adobe Camera Raw. And then in Nevada City this weekend, I found this Leocarpus fragilis. So these this slime mold is always cool to see. I kind of like how it looks when it attaches. And then for my travels out east, here's a Gibalula. And this was found by Jao Arujo. And he is one of the world's expert on cordyceps and related genera. And getting the mushroom hunt with him was really fun because he has a very unique strategy. What he does is when he walks through the woods, he just reaches for every plant and flips over the leaves and looks on the underside of the leaves. Or he'll just walk under some branches, and instead of looking down, he looks up to the underside of the leaves that are just above his head. And he found this really cool Bavaria growing on a spider. And he says that these kind of things are actually not very uncommon at all. They're widely distributed. They're all over California and just about the whole world. But you never see them unless you flip over leaves and look carefully at what you see under there. So this was about, this was real small, less than a centimeter long. But I've learned that it's definitely worth your while to flip over leaves. And now I do it all the time. And I see cool stuff like this pretty often. Especially like in Mendocino County and probably Santa Cruz as well, and the underside of sword ferns, you see a lot of really cool stuff like this. Here's a Chromelis boreapsis covalescens, and this is a purple fuzz that grows at the base of pine trees out east. And so for this one, I just focused as close as I possibly could with the manual focus on the macro lens. And what I do is I focus the lens all the way close, and then I pull the camera back until the whole scene is blurry because it's focused just a little bit too far. And then I use focus shift shooting, which Canon calls focus bracketing, to take a whole series of photos where it changes the focus a little bit every picture. And then I reassemble them later with Helicon on the computer. And I got a few more slides about that, but that's the only way to get really nice, sharp photos of tiny things. So you can see how big the moss is. Just one blade of moss is just about filling the screen here. And so just get that kind of magnification, you really need to take multiple photos. But you don't need a fancy DSLR camera to do that. You can use a cheap $100 DSLR camera. And I'll talk more about that when I go into the slides about focus stacking. This one I found at MycoFest in Pennsylvania, and I found it in someone's basket. And I was just kind of met somebody in the woods and walked up to them and was talking about the stuff in their basket. And this Pluteus kind of stood out. And I picked it up and I smelled it, and it smelled really unusual, a lot different than any other Pluteus, but it didn't have any blue staining on it or anything. But I said, this one looks kind of interesting. May I have this one? And they're like, yeah, of course. And so I threw it in my tackle box. And a couple hours later, when I got back, the whole thing had turned blue, especially the stem. So this is Pluteus americanus, and it was turning blue due to the psilocin polymerization. So that's the blue staining that you see in all the psilocybin mushrooms. But I only had one mushroom, and it wasn't in very good shape. The stem was broken. But I wanted to get a good picture of it, so I tried to get the best picture I could just based on what I had. And so I took this one mushroom and I set it down on a piece of black velvet, and then did photo stacking, starting at the stem there, and I stacked about 100 photos going all the way up the stem. I also had a few lights around it. But I was able to make something that looks pretty reasonable, even though all I had was one beat up mushroom. And then here's Cordyceps militaris. And this one I photographed with ultraviolet light. Looks pretty cool with regular light, but with ultraviolet, you get this amazing royal blue color that I like a lot. And this one is also focus stacked. And then I was down in Jalisco this July and saw Marasmius rotula. And I like this one because it looks like it's made of porcelain. So this was a place called Sierra Tequila. And these are very tiny mushrooms, like they were both under a centimeter tall. And for polypores, it's a really good idea to photograph the top, but the really interesting part is the underside. So when I flipped this polypore over, I found the underside looks like this. So the underside is even more important to photograph than the top. And this one is called Hexagonia hirta, and named Hexagonia because of the hexagonal pores on the underside. Another cool polypore that looks a little bit boring from the top, but when you flip it over, it looks awesome, is Plectropsis crispa. And this one is all over out east, and I think they get it in the Pacific Northwest as well. And here is some kind of gymnopus or rhodocolibia from Jalisco. What I like to do is when I find a cluster of mushrooms, then I will find a few other mushrooms that are growing like somewhere else and set them down right next to the cluster. So I found just that one cluster growing naturally and then took some really mature ones, put them on the left there, and then some younger ones over on the right. And that way I get one photo that has all of the features in the same picture. You have the gills, the upper stem, the stem base, the top of the cap, everything in one photo. And that's a really nice way to take pictures. So I pretty much always try to take at least one picture in that style of everything I photograph. And then also when I was in Guadalajara, I was staying at my friend's house and he handed me some Psilocybe cubensis. But it wasn't a regular Psilocybe cubensis. It was a strain called Enigma that never fruits. And so to make it look cool, I took some of them and I cut it in half so you can see a cross section. And when I'm doing cross sections, it's really important to use an extremely sharp blade. So a very sharp knife works well, but what works even better for me are brand new razor blades. And I say brand new because once you use the razor blade just a few times, it gets actually a lot duller and it doesn't cut nearly as cleanly. So I always carry a bunch of razor blades in my wallet. And then after I've used it a few times, then I kind of retire it and use it for something else. But a brand new razor blade can give you incredible cross sections, and it's extremely important for things like rhizopogon and truffle-like things, puffballs, and anything like that. But really, any mushroom can benefit from a cross section. And if you don't take a cross section, you might find that there's some closely related species that you need to see the context. And by the context, they mean the inside flesh to tell them apart. And like for things like Agaricus californicus and Agaricus xanthodermis, with Agaricus xanthodermis, the whole thing will stain yellow. With Agaricus californicus, only the stem base stains yellow. So if you cut it in half and take a photo of it cut in half, then it makes it easy to see which parts are staining yellow. And here's a cordyceps. João Rujo says this is undescribed cordyceps. I found this near Guadalajara. But when I found that only that top part was sticking out. So when you see stuff like this, and by like this, I mean you have kind of like a stick with the cap coming up and a whole lot of little bumps on the cap. That means that it's really important not to just pull the mushroom out, but to very carefully pop it out from below with a knife. And so when I'm mushroom hunting, I like to carry a pretty big knife. I think the one I carry now is at least 6 inches long, and these really big knives are really good for digging. And so you can just reach the blade way down into the soil, and for amanitas, it's really nice, and cordyceps and all sorts of things, you just pop them out from below, and then the stem doesn't break when you pick it, and you can see the whole thing. This cordyceps was growing on a butterfly pupa. And here's some Abortoporus biennis. And I like these just because you can see all the reflections in the drops. In fact, in this one, you can even see the camera lens and the photographer reflected in this drop. And here's a nice Calocera that I found in Amsterdam. And some Hemimycena that's from Jackson State Forest. And so these are really tiny. You can see how big the cypress stuff looks. And for things this tall, there's just no way to get a good photo of them without focus stacking. So this was about 120 pictures combined into one. And I really like how the gills look. And when you have a focus stacked photo like this, you can zoom way in, much higher resolution than we have here on Zoom, and see the really fine details on the stem. There's another Hemimycena that was growing right next to it. And also right next to it, this is Entoloma subincarnea. And these are really cool, and they like cypress stuff, but you rarely find very many of them. In fact, in this one, I found only just one of them. And so I knew that since I only had one, I had to make it look as cool as possible. So I took all my LED lights out and I put them off to the side and a little bit behind the mushroom and did focus stacking and ended up with a pretty reasonable photo, even though there was only one mushroom. And the focus stacking techniques also work really well with plants, but not outside, because if there's any movement of the subject when you're focus stacking, then you get all of these double and triple images, and it just doesn't look good at all. So if you're focus stacking plants that are almost always blowing a little bit in the breeze, you pretty much always have to take them indoors, or at least like pick the flower and set it down on a black velvet or something, because otherwise there's just too much movement. So this is Salvia divinorum. It's the hallucinogenic mint from Oaxaca. And this one, my friend grew it in his garden, and I got a cutting and brought it indoors, put it in a flower vase with some lights all around it and black velvet behind it. And I was able to get some really nice pictures of the flowers that way. And that also applies for mushrooms that are very thin, like little parasolas or inky caps that like to blow in the breeze. Most mushrooms don't blow in the breeze, but really small, sapphirellas with thin stems, they definitely will. And slime molds, always super cool to photograph. This one's Serratio fruticulosa. And here's an Amanita muscaria just coming out of the button. I found this one in Pacifica. And then when they get a little bit older, they look like this. And finally, the red comes out. So I took this one and I broke it up and put it on agar. And everybody says you cannot grow Amanita muscaria. And that's sort of true in that you can't fruit Amanita muscaria. But if you clone Amanita muscaria to agar, it will grow just fine on agar. And you'll know you have the right culture if its only grows about 1 centimeter per month. So it's super slow in agar. But I took my agar plate after it had been growing about a month and threw it on the microscope and used the 10 times objective. So that gives me 100 times magnification. And I got this photo of the Amanita muscaria myceliums growing across the agar. Here is Alloclaveria purpurea from up in Washington. And this Mycena strobilinoidea is one of my favorite ones from Mount Rainier. So this is how I found them in nature. And then I did another one where I set down a few mushrooms in front of it. But then everything I photograph, I also always collect. And the reason for that, there's a few reasons for that, but one of them is because mushrooms, as beautiful as they are macroscopically, are just as beautiful on the microscopic level. So I took a gill and just threw it on a slide, and here the gill edge is along the top, and you can see why the gill edges have that red color on them. They have a whole bunch of very orange cells that are concentrated along the gill edge. So this is magnified 100 times. And then I magnified it 1,000 times. And this is the gill edge right here. So this is Chylocystidea with really cool ornamentation and pigmentation. And then I kind of press down on the cover slip, and that breaks all the cells free. And then it looks like this. So you can, after you break the cells free, you can see the whole cell, and that allows you to see the full shape and also allows you to measure the cells. And so the smaller something is, the more important it is to image stack. And that becomes even more important with the microscope. So for these images, what I do is I connect the camera to the microscope, and then I press down on the shutter in high-speed shooting mode. So it's taking somewhere between 1 and 10 images per second. And then I very slowly turn the fine focus on the microscope. And that gives me a whole stack of images through the microscope. And then I just load those into the Helicon and combine them together. And that gives me a whole lot of depth of field with the microscope. And it's really nice because you can see the whole cell instead of just seeing the little bits of it that are usually in focus. Here's an Uroscalpium that I found in Point Reyes. This one I like because it was growing from an old Uroscalpium that was growing on a Douglas fir cone. So if you zoom in, you can see last year's and then this year's growing right out of it. And these Uroscalpiums are really cool to photograph up close, just because the teeth look so nice and all of the hairs on the stem look really cool. And then some mushrooms will exude some sort of latex or liquid. So this is Mycena haematopus. And this is one of the easiest mycenas to identify on the West Coast because it's one of the only ones that has the fringed cap margin there. But it's also full of this red liquid. So I just took a brand new razor blade and just cut the edge of the cap with the razor blade, and that allowed a whole bunch of this liquid to come free and get a photo like this. And also you can take a boring mushroom photo and spice it up by adding some decoration. So usually that involves finding some moss, but in this case I added a rattlesnake, and this is Amanita bassii from Jalisco, and then the rattlesnake is Crotalus basiliscus, the Mexican West Coast rattlesnake. But the best things to add are little, especially for like mycorrhizal fungi, are leaves like from the host tree. So if you're finding a mycorrhizal mushroom that's growing with Quercus agrifolia, like the coast live oak, then get a sprig of oak leaves and put those near the mushrooms, and also some acorns, and put those over on the other side. Or if it's a pine, if it's mushroom that's growing with pine, then get some pine cones and put those in the photo.
Alan,
Yes.
you seem to have a question about how you added the rattlesnake.
Oh, okay.
Quite carefully, I assume.
That's a really good question. I was actually out hunting with Laura Guzman, who is one of the world's best mycologists. She teaches a lot of mycology classes at the University of Guadalajara. And her husband studies rattlesnakes, and his name is Fanti. And so we were out hunting, and Fanti walked up with a basket, and the basket was buzzing because he had a rattlesnake in it. And so I said, "Oh, cool, let's find some mushrooms." And then he safely and carefully placed the rattlesnake in front of the mushrooms. And I was using a 100mm macro lens at the time, so that allowed me to be pretty far away from the mushrooms and still get this nice zoomed in shot. But he assured me that he had not been bitten by a rattlesnake for 6 months before this, so I felt pretty safe. I also really like to get photos printed up. And these photos, this is an art exhibition that I did in Savannah, Georgia, this Christmas. And most of these are printed on metal. And printing them on metal looks really cool. And it's actually really easy to get stuff printed on metal. Although a couple of them are on acrylic, like this one over here, it's printed on acrylic. And then a less expensive option is to get them printed on foam board. But this one is 20 inches by 30 inches. And so you can order these things in any size, and you upload a really high resolution image to one of these websites, and then they can print out on lots of different media your mushroom photos. And the best one is Bay Photo, and they're based in Scotts Valley. And so you can even pick the stuff up in person if you're local to the Santa Cruz area. But Bay Photo has real good customer service, and they also have a lot of different options. So their metal prints look spectacular. You can do them in glossy or matte or all sorts of different finishes, and then they have really nice hangers on the back. And it's actually cheaper to get something printed on metal than it is to get printed on paper and frame it. Quite a bit cheaper. For example, like a 12 by 12 metal print, if you were to just order it and have it delivered to your house with shipping, it's about $70. But you can also just do like photo prints and calendars and all sorts of cool different stuff in there. And then Artbeat Studios also does excellent metal printing. And so I order quite a bit from both Artbeat Studios and Bay Photo. And I find that I can't really tell the difference between the quality on those two. That they both just look super sharp, and the colors look great, and the finish looks great, and it's super smooth, and it's really professional work. Also, I sometimes order from Easy Canvas Prints, and they do a good job with canvas prints. Even pretty large canvas prints are not very expensive. Like it's maybe like $40 for a 16 by 16. It's perpetually like 93% off. But I also noticed they had metal prints the other day, and I ordered some of the metal prints, and I wasn't too impressed with the quality. They kind of had these cheap hangers on the back, and it was real thin aluminum. And then when I looked real closely at the surface, it was just slightly rippled. So I wouldn't recommend getting metal prints from Easy Canvas Prints, but I was pretty happy with their canvas prints. And then the last one, Discount Canvas Prints. Just like it says, they're really inexpensive. You can get like these 8x8 canvas prints done for about $5 each. So ridiculously cheap. And you know, they're so inexpensive, you can just like pass them out. But the quality isn't super good. And if you flip them over, it says discount all over the back. But still kind of cool. You can like fill a wall with them for not too much money.
How archival are these prints? Will they hold up to daylight?
Yeah, they have an ultraviolet coating on them, so that blocks the ultraviolet, and so yeah, it makes it see it will hold up to daylight. And also, when you order them, they have a whole bunch of different options. And one of the options, for a couple extra dollars, you can have them add a protective coating. And so if I was going to put it somewhere where it was in bright sunlight, I would definitely have that protective coating added. Also, you know, they look best in glossy, because that's how they look sharpest. But if you have really bright light in the room, then you get real strong reflections off of the glossy. So in really bright areas, I would use the matte or one of the softer finishes, and then you know, they don't have the sharp reflections. So now I'm going to talk a bit about how to take pictures, and first with the cell phone. And there's a lot of reasons to use a cell phone for taking pictures of mushrooms. You know, probably the most important reason is you always have it with you. And that's super important. And they actually work really well for big mushrooms. For large mushrooms, often I can't even tell the difference between a cell phone photo and a photo that I take with a fancy camera, unless I'm really zooming in. But like just for like website or social media, or just you know, things like that, for large mushrooms, you know, big old Cortinarius or something, cell phones do a really good job. But for tiny mushrooms, they do not do a very good job. And that is where a macro lens is super important. And then when you use a real nice lens, you have the way the background blurs is called the bokeh. And cell phones do not have very good bokeh. So the mushroom might look nice, but the blurry background behind it probably does not look very nice. But the main thing, or one of the main things you can adjust on a camera, is the depth of field. So that tells you, that way you can tell the camera how much of it you want in focus. And with the cell phone, you don't have that adjustment. So you just get fixed depth of field. But cell phones are super fast. You know, if you set up a camera on a tripod, your friends might start giving you dirty looks after about 5 minutes, but you can just like stop and snap a quick photo with the cell phone and be on your way. And then when I'm using an expensive camera, then it also takes a lot of work on the computer. In fact, I spend as much time on the computer as I spend in the field looking for and photographing the mushrooms. So if you don't want to spend all that time in the computer, you don't have all that time, you're much better off using a cell phone than a camera. And then if I carry a camera, I also need to set up a tripod. And so that's, you know, more time spent in the field, more stuff to carry. But you know, it's really cool to take photos with the iNaturalist app. And if you take photos with a cell phone and immediately add them to the iNaturalist app, then it can get the really accurate GPS coordinates. And you don't have to spend any time in the evening uploading to iNaturalist. You just, as soon as you get back and it gets within cell phone's range, it'll start uploading your photos. And that's really cool. And then Mushroom Observer recently released their app. And that works pretty well too. And it makes it super easy to share the pictures when you have it on a cell phone. So here's some matsutake that I found up in, this was in Humboldt County, the Eureka Arcata area. And so I took a picture with a cell phone. So this is a cell phone photo. And then I took the exact same picture with my macro lens and focus stacking. And if you look really closely, the cell phone photo doesn't have quite as much detail in the stem. The background doesn't look quite as cool, but you really have to look closely. And the professional camera didn't really noticeably do much better of a job. So for big mushrooms, the cell phones are great. And makes a huge difference where you hold the cell phone. So you really want, like when I'm setting up the mushroom or deciding where to hold the cell phone, I really think a lot about what I want it to look like. And just like putting the phone in a different spot makes the photo come out so much differently. It's really cool to put the phone behind the light, so the light's coming from behind the mushroom, and then go around the other side and put it so the light is coming from in front of the mushroom, and just take photos from all angles. You can do that real quick with the cell phone. And just holding the phone up right on top of the mushroom never looks good. You usually want to put the camera pretty close to the ground. And with the phones, you have the camera there and you can flip the phone upside down so it's right on the ground. And that can make your pictures look really cool. And then the selfie mode can also be pretty cool. Sometimes you can like slide it under a mushroom if it focuses that close. And there is one control that you do have on a cell phone that is super important, and that is called exposure compensation. So that's just how light or dark the photo should be. And so usually you want to turn the exposure compensation down. And that's usually because the background is like leaves or soil, and that's a dark background. But the phone wants to meter the light for the background, and then the mushroom itself is overexposed. And when the mushroom gets overexposed, it's too bright, and the photographer calls that the whites getting blown out. And when that happens, the data is lost and it's gone forever. There's nothing you can do in Photoshop to bring that data back. So you just lose detail in all of the bright parts of your image. So when you lower the exposure compensation, then you get really good detail in all the bright parts of your image. And you can always load your photos into Photoshop or another photo editor later, and you can always raise the color levels. So you can always, raise the brightness. But you can never lower the brightness because once it hits maximum brightness, that data is just gone. So on an iPhone, you kind of tap the box to focus on the mushroom, and then you get the sun icon over on the right. And when you drag that sun down towards the bottom of the screen, you make the photo darker. And when you drag the sun up towards the top of the screen, you make the photo lighter. So if you're photographing some mushrooms on a white piece of paper, the mushrooms are always going to look like dark shadows unless you drag that sun up, because it's going to try to meter the light for the white paper. You really want the whites on the paper to be blown out entirely, and that way the mushrooms will look really good. But usually, you have the darker background with the lighter colored mushroom. So usually you're dragging that sun down, especially with ultraviolet photography. You almost always have to lower the exposure compensation. And then on a DSLR, your exposure compensation looks more like this. So if you set it to +1, your photos all come out too bright. -1, your photos come out too dark usually. You always want to err on the side of your photo being too dark. So if you have a small mushroom, the way to get the best image with a cell phone is to move the phone as close as possible. So you move it so close that it starts to get blurry, and then you just move your phone back until the image gets sharp. And that's the closest your phone can focus. If your phone has manual focus, like a Samsung phone, then use that, just set all the way close. If you don't have a Samsung phone, you can download an external camera app like Open Camera, and that will let you do manual focus on your cell phone. But once you've focused as close as you can, then you use the digital zoom to make the mushroom fill the screen. So you just kind of like pinch your fingers and just make it so the mushroom is as big as possible. And once you've done that, that's the best quality that you can get with the cell phone and a tiny mushroom. Here's an example. Mushroom was really small, and I took this with my cell phone. Doesn't look awesome, but it also doesn't look terrible. But even more important than any of the things I've talked about before is which mushrooms you choose to photograph. So you generally want to photograph mushrooms where you find several different mushrooms in different stages of development. And a dried out mushroom will never look cool. So I always want mushrooms in good condition. And then, the stem base, it is good if you're actually just like picking for the table. You don't want to bring the stem bases with you, but your mushroom photos never look good with the stems cut off. So you should pluck the mushrooms out of the ground with the stem bases intact. Ideally, pop them out with a knife from below, and then take your pictures. And if you're going to collect them for the table, then cut those stem bases off and save the mushrooms. If you're doing scientific collections, you keep the stem bases on there. But if you do cut the stem bases off, you can replant those under the same kind of tree or in the same kind of substrate, and then new mushrooms will grow out. So here is a Mycena that I found. And so I found that nice cluster and then set a few other Mycenas down next to it. Same thing with this Craterellus. And all cameras really do is capture the light. So lighting is extremely important. And occasionally the natural light is perfect and there's nothing you can do in order to improve the natural light. But that's kind of rare. Only about 10% of the time I find that to be the case. So with most of my pictures, I find I can make them better by adding a little bit of extra light. And so what I try to do is have about 90% of the light be natural light, and then have about 10% of the light be artificial light that I add, little LED lights that I carry. And that way you still have a nice natural look, but it kind of fills in the shadows a little bit. And you usually do not want to use that on-camera flash because the flash is right above the lens. So when you use an on-camera flash, the gills will always be right in that shadow from the flash. And that's exactly where you don't want the shadow for mushroom photography. Here is a picture that I took of a Lacaria. And as you can see, this is not a very good. And the reason this is not a very good picture is because the mushrooms were kind of like in the shade. And then there was this really bright field, this really sunlit field behind me. So I had set up my camera and the macro lens and the lights and took the picture with the photo stacking, and it just did not look very good. So what I did is I took a piece of black velvet out of my backpack that I got on eBay, and I just put the black velvet up in some branches behind the mushroom, and I took the exact same photo with the same settings. And it turned out way differently. In fact, it's one of the best pictures I've ever taken. And all I did was just put that black velvet there. And then here's the underside here. And here's another picture with black velvet. And this is Celestibi aztecorum from Mexico. So if you have some mushrooms that are already picked, the black velvet really helps.
Oh, and there is a question. Do you use a flash diffuser?
That's a good question. The flash, I don't use flash, so I don't use flash diffuser, but I probably could benefit from using flash diffuser even with my LED lights. But if I did use flash, I would definitely use a flash diffuser. Occasionally, I'll take like a white t-shirt and then bounce my LED lights off of the white t-shirt. And that just makes the light come from a larger area. I also carry some longer lights, which are kind of like have a built-in diffuser. And I will show you that in a second. So here are the 3 LED lights that I carry. And so this one on the bottom right is the Ulanzi VL49. And those are my favorite lights. And these I like the best because they charge with USB-C. So they have rechargeable batteries inside. You can turn the brightness up and down. So I usually have the brightness way down so they don't look artificial, but they just kind of fill in a little bit. And then you can set them to any color in the rainbow. So I usually just set them for like a medium white. And the other one I like is this Ulanzi VL110. because it's just like a really long bar of light. So it doesn't cast a harsh shadow because the light is coming from such a large area. And this is how I usually deploy the lights. I'll just hold one of them on each side of the lens. And you can see they're pretty far back and they're super dim compared to the sun. So I'm not adding very much light, but it does make a big difference. Now in this picture, you can see I'm holding my cell phone and I have the flashlight on my cell phone. And so I lit this with the light of my cell phone. And what I did is I set this up for long exposure, but you can see I'm kind of shooting up against the sky. And so there was like really bright light coming in from the sky. The mushrooms just looked like silhouettes. So I had about a 2-second exposure. And so what I did is I turned on the flashlight of my cell phone, and then I moved my cell phone flashlight in an arc under the lens while the shutter was open. And since it was moving, since the light was moving while the shutter was open, it didn't cast any harsh shadows. It's like having a really big light or a diffuser. But it gave me just enough light where I could see the detail on the stems and the caps. Here's the picture that I took here, lit with my cell phone flashlight. And then here's one of Cordyceps tenuipes that I found in West Virginia. And here's the same picture with artificial light. So this is natural light. And when you do natural light, the background is a lot more lit up. And then when you do artificial light, the background is a lot dimmer because I have the light so close to the subject that the background is kind of dim by comparison. In this particular image, I like the natural light a whole lot better than the artificial light because the light's kind of coming from behind the subject there and it gives it a lot more texture. Whereas this artificial light was coming right in front of the subject. So probably for a good comparison, I should have held the artificial light kind of back at a sharp angle, kind of behind it. It would look a little better, but sometimes natural light's better, sometimes artificial light's better. So it's best to take a few pictures holding the light in different spots, and then you can see later how you like them best. So cameras, there's a lot of reasons not to carry cameras. They're really expensive, they're heavy, they're big, and once you get a nice camera, then you need a bunch of lenses. Not necessarily, I actually only carry one lens all the time, but most photographers have a bunch of lenses. And then you got to carry all those too. And if you're going to use a camera, you pretty much need a tripod. And the reason for that is because you're either closing down the aperture to get lots of depth of field, which requires a long exposure, or you're doing focus stocking, so you're taking a lot of pictures, so the camera needs to be very still for that reason. And also you'll have the ISO down. I'll talk about ISO a little bit later, but in any case, if you're going to carry a camera, then you might as well carry a tripod so you can get really good pictures. But that takes time to set up and it's heavy. But a really cool thing about carrying a tripod is that you can take a picture and then look at the picture on your camera screen. Or new cameras, the picture goes instantly to your phone and you can look at it on your phone. But you can see all the flaws in your photo and then adjust your picture. So maybe you'll take some pine needles or leaves out from the foreground, or you'll light it a little bit differently, or you'll just, you can just keep taking the exact same picture until it comes out how you like it. And that's something you can't really do with a cell phone because the cell phone's always moving around. But for me, it's totally worth it to carry a camera because the resolution is a whole lot higher. So I can print very large size images, and I can also crop a whole lot and it still looks nice and sharp. And then with a camera, you can use all sorts of interesting lenses. Usually you want to use a macro lens. And the only thing a macro lens does differently than a regular lens is that it can focus very close. So when you're focusing very close, then you're seeing a whole lot of detail. But with the camera, you can adjust the depth of field. And the depth of field is how much is in focus at one time. So the depth of field is controlled by the aperture. And so the aperture is controlled by the f-stop. So it's an actual physical aperture inside the lens, and it's like a pinhole that can close down really tight or it can open up really wide. When you open up the aperture really wide, we call that like f2.8 or even less. And then you have very narrow depth of field, but you're letting a whole lot of light into the lens, so you don't have to open the shutter for very long. When you close the aperture way down, all of a sudden your depth of field gets much greater. So things that are close and things that are far are both in focus at the same time. So when you close the aperture down beyond f8, then you lose sharpness on the whole image. So everything gets, you get more depth of field, so more is in focus, but everything in the whole image gets a little bit more blurry. So here's a photo that I took with the aperture all the way open. You can see that the mushrooms are nice and sharp right where they're closest to me. But then when you see like the stems and the mushrooms in the back, those are all blurry. And that's because the aperture was wide open, so very narrow depth of field. And then here's another photo that I took at f22. And here you can see that the stem bases are in very sharp focus and the mushrooms in sharp focus. And then the background, that moss behind the mushroom is also in sharp focus. So that's the wide depth of field. You still have pretty good resolution, even when you close the aperture all of the way. But when you really zoom in, the image is a lot sharper when the aperture is open. So when you have a camera, you can put all sorts of different lenses on them. And I recommend macro lenses because that way you can focus really close and get really cool pictures of tiny things. There's really no disadvantage to a macro lens. You can still take really good pictures of things that are far away. And a lot of the macro lenses that people use for mushroom photography are also great lenses for portrait photography. But the only lens that I carry is a 50mm macro lens. So this on the left is the lens that I use. It's for Nikon. It's razor sharp, and I like it a lot. But the camera that I use is a full frame sensor, so it's a very large sensor. A lot of cameras have what's called a crop sensor, and so that's a smaller sensor. And when you use a smaller sensor, then things look more zoomed in. So if you have a camera that's not full frame, then I recommend a 30mm macro lens. So that's for like the DX sensor or the micro four thirds sensor. But if you have a really expensive camera with a really big sensor, the 50mm macro lens, and those are about equivalent. There's also what's called a wide angle macro lens. And these are pretty cool because you can get real close to a mushroom and get the mushroom in focus, but then you also see the whole background. So you see all the forest behind the mushroom, and so it kind of puts the mushroom into context. Here's a couple options from Laowa. These things are really hard to use. This one on the left I have, this is the Laowa 15mm macro lens. And this thing will, when you want to focus on something real small, the working distance is less than a centimeter. So the mushroom has to be almost touching the glass in front. And then it's really hard to get light in there. So it's difficult to focus, really close. And just when you're that close, you're going to be casting a shadow on the mushroom. So it's not going to look good. You can still kind of do it. It's still a really cool lens, but it's very difficult to use. It's also manual focus and manual aperture. So that's also challenging. And then this lens on the right is even crazier. This is a probe lens, also made by Laowa. And so the part in the front is waterproof, so you can dip it into water. And it is a macro lens. And so you can just like kind of stick this down. You can stick this probe like up under a mushroom and get a beautiful photo of the mushroom's gills, or stick it into a stream and get a beautiful photo of like the eye of a fish or some algae or something like that. But it's definitely not very useful in most situations. Another thing you can set on your camera is ISO. And the ISO tells you how sensitive the sensor is. So when you turn the ISO down, you're turning down the sensitivity of your sensor, and that makes the photo less grainy. So essentially, the camera is very sure about each photon that comes in. And so you have to keep the shutter open for a long time in order to get enough light to get a good picture with low ISO. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you can turn the ISO way up, and that allows for a real faster shutter speed. But when you zoom way in, your images are grainy. However, grainy images are way better than images with motion blur. So if you're just taking handheld shots without a tripod, you generally want to turn your ISO up pretty high. And then if you're using a tripod, you generally want to turn the ISO down all the way as far as it can go, because you already have the camera still. You might as well let it sit there a few seconds and gather the light and be as sure as possible about every pixel in the image. And then an advanced technique for getting really good images is focus stacking. And focus stacking allows you to bend the laws of physics by combining multiple images into one output image. So you're taking a whole bunch of different pictures, and there's a lot of ways to take a whole bunch of different pictures. You can even do it with a cell phone. Probably want a cell phone tripod, but just by focusing on different parts of the scene with your cell phone and taking pictures, then you can load that into focus stacking software and get everything in focus. And then a lot of modern cameras have what's called focus bracketing or focus shift shooting. And that uses the autofocus on the lens to very slightly change the focus and take a whole series of pictures. And it does that very quickly. And that's what most professional photographers use these days. However, you don't need a fancy camera to do focus stacking. You could get a $100 DSLR that's 15 years old on eBay, and then get a cheap old macro lens and manually do this and get the exact same results. And by manually do this, I mean take a picture and then change the manual focus on the lens, and then take another picture and then change the manual focus on the lens, and repeat until you have all of the parts of the image. Or you can move the camera closer a little bit for each shot. And I find that actually works really well when I have a lot of light. So if I can shoot in 1/120th of a second or faster, there's really bright light, then I can just turn my camera on high speed shooting mode and just hold down the shutter. And while I'm holding down the shutter and it's taking photos really quickly, like 5 or 6 per second, then I'm slowly moving the camera closer to the subject, and you can shoot a stack that way. And it's actually not a big problem if your camera is shaking a little bit because it's in your hands, because it aligns the images. What is a big problem is if some things in your image are moving and other things are not. Like if something's blowing in the wind, that's a big problem. But if your hand's a little bit shaky because you're just holding your camera, it'll calculate and compensate for that. So here's a good example of an image that you can tell is focus stacked. And the way you can tell it's focus stacked is because we have a lot of depth of field here. The whole mushroom is completely in focus, but the background is super blurry. So if I had shot this picture all in one shot, I would either have only a very small part of the mushroom in focus, or I could have closed the aperture and gotten all of the mushrooms in focus, but then the background would be in focus too. So focus stacking gives you very good separation between the mushroom and the background. And the way you're getting that good separation is by keeping the aperture all the way open. And so with the wide open aperture, you get beautiful blurry backgrounds. So a lot of times when I'm taking focus stacked images in the field, it looks kind of like this. And here I have a light as close as possible to the lens, so it doesn't cast any shadow. In this case, I just have the camera laying on the ground. And I do that a lot. It lets me get the camera a lot lower than the tripod can get. And mushrooms look really cool when the camera is just sitting right on the ground. So here in the Nikon menu is the focus shift shooting. And here you can see that it is set up to take a whole bunch of pictures. It's going to take 59 pictures with 0 delay in between the picture. And it's going to change the focus by a factor of 5 each time, which is the default. And it's also not opening and closing the shutter each time, so it takes them all silently. And the first frame exposure lock is off. So that means if the light gets brighter or dimmer while it's taking the stack, it'll adjust the exposure. If you turn that on, then it's locked. And if the light gets brighter, then stuff gets exposed differently. And that can actually be really nice because sometimes I'll turn that on and I will move the light closer as it's going through the stack because I want different parts of the image lit, brighter or dimmer. So after I've taken that stack, I go home and load them up in the computer. This is Adobe Bridge, which is just a photo viewer. And I select the first image on the stack. And you can see here, this is the very first one that I'll use because the very closest part of the mushroom is in focus. And then I flip through all the images and find the very last image I'll use. And that's this one here. You can see just the very furthest part of the mushroom is in focus. And then I select all of those images and drag them over into Helicon. Helicon is commercial software. I think it's about $100 to $150 for a lifetime license, but it does have a free 30-day trial if you want to just try it. And then there's also Zerine Stacker, which is commercial software that also has a free 30-day trial. And then there's also Combine ZP, and Combine ZP is freeware that does the same thing, and it works really well. So those are the three options for software to do the stacking. Anyways, I drag those all into Helicon, and then I hit render, and it thinks for about 10 seconds, and then I get this. And I can zoom way in, and you can see it looks really cool. And when I was doing the rendering, you see that there's a few different methods over here. And this is the algorithm that it uses to combine the images. And what it's basically doing is finding the part of each image that has the most contrast. And the part of the image with the most contrast happens to be the part that is in focus the most. So method A is just bad and you shouldn't use it. Method B is the best, especially for shiny things like droplets. And then method C is best for the background. A lot of times what people do is do both method B and method C and combine them. What I do is I use this retouching feature. And so I don't think I have any slides on retouching, but basically, if you look up here, you see the retouching tab. And so I'll clip over to the retouching tab, and then I will just be able to paint over the image with one of the source images. And so I'll take either the first image if I want it more blurry, or the last image if I want it less blurry, and paint over the background with one of those images. And that gives me the best possible background because the software isn't trying to guess which image it wants to use for the background. It just has a really nice, smooth image. And that gives you a really cool looking photo with a really good background. Anyways, after I'm done with that, then I save it out of Helicon as a TIFF, and I load it into Photoshop and then open up the Adobe Camera Raw filter. And then you have a million different things that you can adjust on here. And so I drag all of these sliders up and down until the image looks on my screen like it looked in the field. Something like that. And then I export it to JPEG and I am done. So the whole process for photo stacking, it takes me maybe 10 seconds in the field to actually shoot the mushroom. So, but a minute to set up the camera and tripod, 10 seconds to actually take the photos. And then when I get home, about a minute to assemble the photos, another minute in Photoshop. So by the time it's said and done, I've probably spent about 5 to 10 minutes to take a picture. But it's definitely worth it if you care about image quality. Now here is an image I took of Amanita pantherinoides in Pacifica, California. You see the mushrooms look great, but this flower on the left looks really trippy. And the reason it looks that way is because it was blowing in the wind. So that's what happens when you have everything in your image is completely still, except for one thing that's moving. So I think if anyone's going to buy a camera, they should definitely buy a camera that has the focus stacking. They should definitely buy a camera that has the focus stacking built in because there's it just doesn't make sense to spend a lot of money on a camera that does not have focus stacking, the ability to just stake a stack of photos. Another way to do this is focusing rails. And so focusing rails basically have this thing that you can turn and it moves the camera closer or further from the subject. And so you kind of like, here's a focusing rail here. So you twist the knob and it moves the camera closer, and then you take a picture, twist the knob again, take another picture. That's kind of the old school way to do this. You can also get these automatic focusing rails. And the cool thing about this is you can control it with your cell phone, and then it also hooks into the remote shutter release on your camera. So it moves the camera, then it takes a picture, then it moves the camera again, then it takes a picture again. So these things cost about $300, the Wii Macro Rail. And it's a really good option. It's a whole lot less expensive than buying a new camera that has the focus bracketing feature built in. Here is a really good option for macro photography. Instead of getting an expensive macro lens, or even better than an expensive macro lens if your subject is very small, is a microscope objective. So this is just a plain old microscope objective. You can use any microscope objective, but you generally want to start with the lower magnification ones. So most macro lenses go to about 1x magnification. So this microscope objective that we're looking at here is an AmScope objective. It costs $17. And it's a quality objective. It has plan correction in there. And so that means that you get, the image is sharp both at the center and at the edge of the image. And the only thing you have to do to fit this onto a camera is physically put 160 millimeters of distance between the objective and the sensor. So you just get some kind of tubes and adapters and that end up being 16 centimeters long. And then you can just take whatever microscope objective you want, as long as it has the 160 millimeter tube length that's printed on the objective right here. And you can take pictures. Now, the thing about microscope objectives is that they don't have any kind of focusing in the objective. So to focus, you need to move the camera closer and farther. So that's where the focusing rail becomes really important. So this is a 4x objective. It'll give you 4x more magnification than a standard macro lens. And then extreme macro photographers will use a 10x objective. So if you've ever followed Alison Polak's photography, she's like Marin Mushrooms on Instagram. She has spectacular images of slime molds, and her images are razor sharp, and her subjects are only a couple of millimeters tall, if that. And the reason that she is able to get such amazing photos is she uses microscope objectives instead of a macro lens for the smaller things, and an automatic focusing rail to move the camera every time it takes a picture. The smaller the subject is, the more images you need to take to get the depth of field that you want. So for a slime mold that's only 1 millimeter tall, you'll usually end up stacking 300 or 400 images. Whereas when I'm taking a picture of a really big Cortinarius and I'm using image stacking, I'll stack like 5 or 6 images. It's also really fun to take pictures at night. A couple things you can do at night is, you can control the light completely. So you can use like colored lights, or you can put the light in all different places. Usually if I just want like a good standard mushroom picture, then I open the shutter, long exposure, and move the light in an arc over the lens. And that makes it, pretty nice, even light. But if you want a dramatic picture, then you take the light and you put it behind the mushroom, or do different colors of light. You can paint with light while the shutter's open, and you can get some really cool results. So here's a picture of Craterellus that I took at night. And the really fun thing to do at night is ultraviolet photography. So using an ultraviolet light, you find that a lot of things in nature give off a lot of very unexpected colors, and that's called fluorescence. Most black lights that you see at parties, or just inexpensive black lights, are 395 nanometer. So scientists express the color of light in nanometers. So for example, red light is 800 nanometers and green light is 500 nanometers. But once you get into the ultraviolet range, there's no more names for the colors, so you have to use the numbers. Your eye can see between 400 and 800 nanometers. So once you get below 300, before 400, below 400 nanometers, you can't see it anymore. It's invisible. So most black lights are 395, and those are a little bit visible. You can still see this purple color. And so you get purple color in all of your photos, which is not ideal. Also, a lot of things don't fluoresce very well at this wavelength. So if you want to do ultraviolet photography, or you want to go around the woods at night, you should definitely get a 365 nanometer light. And they're a little bit more expensive and not a whole lot more expensive, but it's so worth it. Now, the other thing is you want a really bright ultraviolet light because you don't want to have to be like right next to the thing to be able to see it fluoresce. So if you get a really bright 365 nanometer light with a nice narrow beam, then you can see things that are fluorescing from 20 feet away, maybe even 100 feet away sometimes. And that makes it a whole lot more fun to walk through the woods at night. But when you have a really bright ultraviolet light, you actually don't need complete darkness. In fact, I can shoot ultraviolet shots in the middle of the day just by kind of like using my backpack to block the sun, or I'll put a little piece of black velvet. As long as I block like 90% of the light, the fluorescence is so bright that I can get really good ultraviolet shots. So here's a picture that I took in West Virginia this summer of Loratiomyces squamosus, just in the middle of the day. And then I blocked the light with a piece of black velvet. I took the same photo with ultraviolet light, and you can see that this mushroom has fluorescent pilocystidia, and it also has fluorescent polycystidia. I like to take the exact same photo with white light and ultraviolet light, and then image stack them and load both photos into Photoshop, and then align the layers. So that way they're completely aligned, and you can just like flip back and forth between the images and see which parts of the images are fluorescing. Here's a nice close-up with the gill edges. And Ganodermas can have really good colors, especially the lacquered ones. So this one is Ganoderma sugae. And here's Mycena phylopes. This one gives you a really nice blue color. That's from Humboldt County. And then Coloriza umbonata, the redwood brooder, is unique. Oh, no, this one is actually an Entoloma bicolor piece. And then some of the Cortinarius fluoresce extremely bright. This is one of the Cortinarius from section, oh, which section was it? I forget, but it's super bright. You can see these things from like 100 meters away. And here's one where I focused really close and image stacked it. And then some of the lichens also look really cool with ultraviolet light. And the russulas are also super fluorescent. And plants also can be really fluorescent. This is Viola glabella. So fluorescent photography is where you shine a black light, but there's another kind of night photography, and that's bioluminescent night photography. And so those are you're photographing organisms that give off their own light. So these are much dimmer, but you don't need any kind of ultraviolet. You just wait for your eyes to adjust to the night, and then you look for the glowing stuff in the forest. And things that are bioluminescent are much, much dimmer than things that are fluorescent. So you really need an extremely dark night, like no moon, no city lights. And you got to let your eyes adjust to the dark for like 3 to 5 minutes. And walking around the woods at night is really dangerous, which of course makes it really fun, but you'll poke your eye out pretty easily. So you definitely want to wear glasses. And then if you do image stacking, that allows you to keep your aperture all the way open, so you can reduce your exposure time and the noise that you have. Here's one light that I like quite a bit, about $100, and it's got a nice tight beam and it's 365 nanometers. So this is one of the lights that I carry with me all the time. Also, you should save all of the mushrooms that you photograph, so you can study them later. You can do spore prints, microscopy, and DNA sequencing. after I photograph something, my next question is, what did I photograph? And so DNA barcoding is the best way to answer that question. And so I'll be able to make these phylogenetic trees and then put a red dot next to the mushroom that I found. And that shows me where in the whole tree of life my mushroom fits in. There's another bioluminescent mycena. This one's pretty cool because the gill edges glow. The bioluminescent Pinella stypticus. Now, people say that Pinella stypticus on the West Coast doesn't glow, and Pinella stypticus on the East Coast glows. I took this photo in Michigan, but actually I photographed Pinella stypticus in Sonoma County glowing pretty brightly. So it's not true. We actually do have glowing Pinella stypticus here. Here is Mycena stylobates. This mushroom doesn't glow, but the mycelium glows. So these Douglas fir needles were glowing pretty brightly. There's Mycena nebula. There's about 20 different mycenas that glow in California. And then Omphalos olivacans and Armillaria also glow. So definitely a fun thing to do, to walk around the woods at night. And that is all I have for you. So happy to hang out and take questions if you have any questions about any of this. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook.
Well, that was pretty good talk, Alan. Every time I see it, I learn a little bit more, probably because I forget a little bit each time too. I'm checking the comments to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, also I change it every time.
Yeah, I've noticed that, and the photos are always spectacular. I notice in the chat now there are a few comments on different software and things. I don't know if you want to read through those. And
let's see. I'm reading through the chat in the Zoom, and someone says the free online focus stacking website, Focus Stacking Online. And I'm not familiar with that one. That sounds pretty cool, so I'll have to check that out. Is there any getting around use of Adobe products, a gross company? And I definitely have mixed feelings about Adobe. It's kind of annoying how they have a subscription model, but it's also pretty good software. So I think the best alternative that I found to Adobe products is the GIMP. And the GIMP is freeware. I find it's harder to use than Adobe. And when I try using the GIMP, my photos don't come out as well as they do with Adobe Photoshop. I don't know if that's just because I don't know how to use it as well, but I started out using the GIMP and used the GIMP under Linux for many years. And then I switched to Photoshop and my photos came out a whole lot better. So I'm not saying the GIMP is bad. I'm just probably saying that I don't know how to use it very well. Let's see, do you use any default settings for macro? So the settings I always use are pretty much always the same, and that is the aperture wide open, always. And the ISO is low as it goes. So that's like ISO 31, f2.8. And then for tiny things, just have the mushroom as close to the lens as you can possibly get it while it's still in focus, and add a little bit of light, and that's it. So it's not too hard. The white balance is also important. I use natural light auto for the white balance. That's kind of different on different things. But also I shoot in JPEG all the time. And most professional photographers will tell you that you should always shoot in RAW if you want the best results. So about twice a year, I end up shooting in RAW just to see if I can get better results. And I'm never able to get better photos shooting in RAW than I get in JPEG. But it sure takes a lot longer to do the stacking in RAW, and it eats up a whole lot more room on the card. So yeah, just shooting in JPEG is what I always do. And probably one of these days I'll shoot in RAW and it'll turn out amazing. And I'll be like, wow, I should shoot in RAW from now on. But I shot a bunch of photos in RAW just a couple days ago, and I was not very impressed with how they came out. I mean, they weren't bad, but they weren't any better than what I would expect with JPEG. So JPEG is a good setting to use as long as you get the color balance right and you get the lighting right. Because with RAW, you can fix the color balance later, you can fix the lighting later. In JPEG, you have to get it right because you cannot fix it later. And then somebody says that I mentioned Amanita muscaria grows on agar but cannot fruit. Why is that? And that is because Amanita muscaria is ectomycorrhizal, and ectomycorrhizal mushrooms need a tree to fruit. And so a lot of ectomycorrhizal mushrooms grow just fine on agar, but as soon as, but you can grow them on agar all the time. You can make grain spawn, but they'll just never actually fruit without having a live tree there. So they have like grown chanterelles indoors in greenhouses, but they grew the tree indoors. And nobody's figured out how to make ectomycorrhizal mushrooms fruit without a tree, even though they've tried quite a bit. Another thing about Amanita muscaria is that the mycelium does not contain any muscimol or ibotenic acid. So I grew this Amanita muscaria on agar, and then I sent the culture to a friend in Germany who had a mass spec, and he was able to very accurately test for muscimol and ibotenic acid. And the fruit body that I picked had plenty in there, and the mycelium, the grew on agar, had absolutely none. But I did do DNA sequencing on my culture to make sure I had the right thing growing, and I did. So yeah, Amanitas are interesting.
Any other questions? People can unmute their microphones if they feel typing limited.
I see somebody ask about the leaves that I turn over. Let's say, I assume you're referring to living plant leaves, tree leaves, or both. Any specific association with a specific species of leaves? And yeah, it's usually living plant leaves. I've never noticed any on like dead leaves, although occasionally they're probably there, but generally just, it's trees, plants, bushes, ferns, any living leaf, you just flip them over and look at the underside and see if you can see any little tiny things. And the things you're looking for are very small, like usually a centimeter would be a real big one. So they could be like 2 or 3 millimeters for a tiny one. Probably about between 3 and 20 millimeters is the size of these things. But they're some of the most beautiful fungi because they're like fruiting off of cordyceps and stuff like that. And they don't seem to be very picky about which leaf, at least not any pickier than the insects themselves are. So certain insects kind of prefer certain leaves, and you'll find those a lot more on whatever leaves they prefer. But a lot of insects are less picky about what plants they're on, and so you find them on all sorts of different leaves. But also, it's definitely best to look at older leaves because an older leaf will have more time for an insect to sit there and then get infected by cordyceps. So like a freshly furled out leaf isn't going to have anything on there. Let's see, what is the best practice to not mix up specimens from the field, the photos and sequence? And that's a really good question because mixing up specimens is really easy. So when I collect, I always collect things with a tackle box. And so different different compartments in the tackle box with different collections. And it's a very good idea to assign a collection number when you're taking the photos. And so you would have a number and you would, in one of your photos, you would put that number in the picture so you can see it. And that way you know like which number collection is each photo. You can also like take a Sharpie and just write a number on a leaf and put that in the photo. And then put that leaf in with the mushrooms. That's another way to do it. A lot of times I'm only collecting like one example of each genus. So if I'm doing that, it doesn't, it's pretty easy to figure out at the end of the day what is what. But if you have if you're picking morels all day and you have 20 different morel collections, there's no way you'll figure out which is which at the end of the day. So numbering them is super important. And then when I put them in the dehydrator, I put the iNaturalist. What I do is I write out a index card, and I write the species, the date, location, and iNaturalist and mushroom observer number on the index card. And then I'll put the mushrooms on top of the index card and put them in the dehydrator. And that way, when I take them out of the dehydrator, when they're all shriveled up, I always know which mushrooms go with which photos. Then I put them into Ziploc bags and put all those bags in alphabetical order by genus, so I can find them later.
Okay. I'm just getting a link to the Continental Mycoblitz. They are, soliciting specimens, and if you follow that link, you'll also get a little bit of information about vouchering specimens, and you can even download voucher slips where you can enter all the data about the mushroom and snip off a little piece that has a number on it and save everything all together. Let me put that up there now.
Yeah, those voucher slips are really nice. They kind of remind you to write down the information. And people used to write really long descriptions when they were vouchering mushrooms, but these days, with the high quality cameras, it's not quite as important to do that. But it's really important to take at least one photo where you have something in there for size, for scale, like a coin or a ruler or something. And also I make sure I write down everything that's not obvious from the photo. And I'll usually, well, pretty much always, I'll do that in the iNaturalist app as I'm taking the pictures. So, and when you use the iNaturalist app or the Mushroom Observer app, you have a field for notes. And in those notes, I write down what trees were around, the texture of the mushroom, texture of the cap, texture of the stem, what it smells like, what it tastes like, and anything else that might be important, but was not visible in the photo. Putting those all in the notes is a really good idea, because after a while, that information just gets lost, and it's pretty important sometimes. Also, I should mention that I'm going to be teaching a mushroom photography workshop in Wisconsin with Allison Polak this summer. So that is towards the end of September in Merrimack Island. It's a really cool part of Wisconsin, just a little bit after the Northwoods foray. And that's a 5-day class that Allison and I are teaching about advanced photography.
Okay, well, see if there aren't any other questions. I guess we can wrap